Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming to another one of our TESS seminars. Of course, TESS is our Center for Tropical Environmental and Sustainability Science here at JCU, which is one of our main forums for terrestrial and aquatic research. We are based here primarily in Cairns, but of course we reach into Townsville and other parts of the JCU system. I've just flown back from the US, and this is the first time I think in 16 years of working with TESS that I have not had my TESS shirt on. This is American. I went to the game, watch my team win. Anyway, but anyway, our speaker today is Dr. Kamaljit Sangha, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Kamal. She's come to hear from Darwin. She's based at Charles Darwin University. She's an associate professor there, and she holds the title of Outstanding Future Researcher, which sounds very eminent in the university there. And she works in ecological economics and a lot of work on indigenous land use, livelihoods, environment, many different things. She was trained at Central Queensland University, came here to JCU for a while with a postdoc, taught here for years, went down to University of Southern Queensland, taught, and now she's at Charles Darwin's. So anyway, it's a real pleasure. We're very happy to have Kamal come speak to us today. Thanks, Kamal.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming here today. And thanks for people online. Thanks, Tess, Annabelle, and Bill for having me here. It's great pleasure to come to this landscape. I feel so connected. So that's why I went out for a 5 minutes walk. It's, I don't know whether you guys realize it. It's very spiritual landscape for me when I come to this kind of landscape. You feel it, you sense it, and you absorb it. And my talk today will be on ecosystem services, indigenous values, the landscape that we live in, and emerging nature-based economic opportunities. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous peoples on the land on which I'm standing today, Jibranji people, and also Larakia country where I work, and also indigenous peoples and local communities across the globe who manage their landscapes beautifully and deliver us ecosystem services, which we don't actually get to appreciate that much as we should be. So I tend to acknowledge that before I start. Just the main things that I'll be covering in this, but I'm happy to discuss more broadly if that's the interest in this audience, that what ecosystem services are, what are the approaches and frameworks that we used for valuing ecosystem services, what indigenous values influence those ecosystem services valuation approaches and frameworks, and what are those people's relationships with the northern landscape, especially in Northern Australia. And I'll provide an overview of these nature-based solutions, which are called nature-based economies, that are very topical in Australia now, and what are the challenges associated with that. Before I start, I wanted to give you my background, where I come from. So I'm originally from India, from that little star that you can see on the map. I don't know whether this northern part of India, from the land of 5 rivers. I think you can see that arrow. It's called Punjab. Panj means 5, Ab means river. But during British partition, it got divided into 2 countries, India and Pakistan, but we speak the same language and share a lot of cultural values together. And I came to Australia in 1999 to do my PhD at Central Queensland University. And as I was saying to Bill, that my main, inside that aspiration was to work on tropical rainforest and explore indigenous people's connections with how they manage and value tropical rainforests. But at that time, I was told that we got plenty of ecosystem services. We don't need to worry about this. So we should be actually working on something that is more critical. And so I ended up working on tree clearing. That was a topical issue in Queensland back in 2000, which was also quite valuable. And then I ended up doing a lot of work in plant ecology that actually led me to include a lot of economics work in that space. So a lot of tree clearing work, but we also gave it an economics outlook. Because when I used to go, so a lot of my work was in central Queensland, working with graziers. You can imagine someone coming from India, small height, and everyone looking at you, and you're working with graziers going on their property. They said, are you able to do this work? And what is the purpose of this work? And I was really fortunate in that space to liaise with some good people who really supported me in my field work. Like I had hard field work for 2-3 years, putting pickets and fences on their property and looking at comparing long-term impacts of clearing on pasture production. And we looked at the native pasture diversity, how actually that influences beef quality, and what are the actual economic returns over that long term of clearing. So like Brigalow country was cleared at a very faster rate at that time. So we kind of projected that where the benefits are, like an initial 5-6 years, 10 years, if the country is really, really able to deliver those nutrients over that long time. But after 20 years, it goes either flat out or it goes down the hill. So when I reported that work, so as part of Ag Force in central Queensland, that used to be the norm, that every 3-4 months or 6 months, you need to go out to face the audience and actually share your results, what you're doing. And slowly, I was able to build up that reputation. But the beauty was that I come from farming background. So that actually helped me to connect with them very quickly. So when I finished my work, because I did a lot of nutrient analysis as well, like the litter fall and all little things that as an ecologist you care for. And they used to ask me, what is the purpose of doing this, all these little bags, and what are you looking for? And at the end, when I put the dollar values on it, so they could get it, okay, this is what it's meant for. So you can compare, you can look at some of those dollar figures, and then people can actually make sense what it is. So at this stage, so I work at Charles Darwin University at the Research Institute for the Environment and Livelihoods, where I've been very fortunate to work as an ecological economist. The kind of core of my whole sense as a human being, where I wanted to work to highlight the importance of nature for decision making and informing policy decision makers in that space. And the team I joined at that time was the Darwin Center for Bushfire Research, which has been doing a lot of work with Professor Jeremy Russell-Smith and others on carbon economy. And when I joined, the carbon economy already kicked off a lot in the Northern Territory, as the Arnhem Land region, the whole 80,000 square kilometer is already kind of under carbon abatement kind of projects. So we've been looking, I joined in 2014. So we started looking at how to expand these carbon economies, looking at people's connections with the landscape. So building up into ecosystem services economies. And now we see that there is a huge momentum nationwide. So we're already kind of fitting and hitting that space. But this whole kind of my involvement in this space has also been informed a lot while I was working at JCU. I joined this, had the opportunity to join this UN's initiative on Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which started in 2000 and ended in 2005. So I was fortunate here when I joined in 2004 to take part in that work and actually developing some framework with case studies, delivering that framework. So the first case study that was reported from Northern Australia in that Millennium Assessment on assessing the links between Indigenous peoples and managing country was in this Millennium Assessment report. And I've been part of the Ecosystem Services Partnership, which is a global organization, more than about 4,000 experts, so which also helped me to build my skills. And more recently, I have been involved with IPES and UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook Report. And of course, TESS, where I co-chair with my colleague, Nick, on local economies, communities, and nature specialist group. So, well, what are ecosystem services? Ecosystem services are basically the benefits that we all get from ecosystems. So the air that we breathe, the scenic beauty that we see, food that we eat, all those are part of ecosystem services, basically the goods and services that we get. So Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was conducted by the United Nations started in 2005, but the final document synthesis came into, started in 2000, the synthesis came in 2005, was the first ever effort where ecologists and economists came together. More than 1,350 people got together, and they wanted to make links between ecosystems and economics, because that has been a big gap between two disciplines so far. While we know that in ecological economics, which became a predominant discipline, just more predominant in the last 20 years, but it has been in existence since 1980s or so. But how to inform economics about the value of ecosystems, that they play a role, still a challenge, but this first effort has been a big kind of achievement for many of those ecological economists in terms of influencing decision-making and having new initiatives, because further it led to IPBES, which is parallel to IPCC. So IPBES stands for Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So what Millennium Assessment did is it highlighted that if there are any changes in ecosystems and ecosystem services, so the state of the ecosystems matter a lot, and then the status of ecosystem services matter a lot in that case. So that if there is any change in those ecosystem services, depending on the state of ecosystems, there is also change in human well-being. There is change in our economy. So a lot of these values are non-monetary, they are hidden in the system, but they do affect. So, and I'll come to that in a bit more detail. But this is much more, this change is much more evident when we talk about indigenous peoples and local communities. So you see it clearly. And in Australian context, it's very clear, because people say, you may have heard about that Healthy Country, Healthy People, you know, flagship program from CSIRO, and many people you will see, if country is sick, I'm sick. Like typically the TOs talk in that language. So the Millennium Assessment Framework actually helps to advance that, but how to interpret it, I think that's the biggest challenge. How to see those links, how to tease them apart. And with Millennium Assessment, which ended in 2005, started IPBES, which officially took off in 2012. And I've been fortunate to part of two assessments of IPBES. The recent one is the Nexus Assessment, which is a big step forward. In this Nexus Assessment, this is the first time that IPBES is actually emphasizing that all different components that we all care for, so biodiversity, water, food, health, climate change, they're all interconnected, and we should be all looking at the nexus of these things rather than just one or the other. So the report should be, the Nexus Assessment report should have been out early this year. Because of some changes within IPBES, it should be out, I think, by the end of this year now. So the frameworks, the first ever framework, and I think very valuable framework that came from Millennium Assessment Study was this. Have any of you seen this one before? Ah, no, okay, so then I can explain that in more detail. So in this group of scientists, ecologists and economists, they, for the first time, sat together and thought what it is from the ecosystems that make sense to human well-being. So which is the bigger picture of our economy, okay? So they looked at ecosystem services concept, the benefits, which was already there. So they looked at 4 different types of ecosystem services, which is provisioning ecosystem services, things like food, water that we get from natural systems, regulating ecosystem services, which is climate regulation, water, flood mitigation. I think many of you probably work in that area. And most importantly, there are cultural ecosystem services, the landscape that we live in. So having a lot of recreational and spiritual values. And I think, yeah, this is a perfect part of the landscape where you got a lot of this ecotourism and recreational values, but also a lot of spiritual and cultural values attached to the landscape. So how these sporting services are underpinning, so usually we don't assess them. So it's mainly those three ecosystem services. Then you try to see their links to the constituents of well-being, which comes from economics, so welfare economics part. So the main constituents of well-being that's been selected through the Millennium Assessment work were the security, which is like, we need to feel secure about accessing resources and having access to good air and water to live on. So basic materials for life that we get, like, you know, like we worry about food security. That's one of the basic material for us. I sometimes say that we worry more about diamonds and gold than we should be worrying about water, which is essential for our life. But we don't value water that way as we value diamonds. So it's just the different notion that's set in our mindset that we think how things are important for human well-being. So health is another one where we feel good being out in the natural environment, having access to clean air and water. Social relations, it's a big thing, especially for indigenous peoples, where they have relations not just within themselves, but also through land, through the landscape. So you'll be connected to this land, the other person will be connected to that piece of land, and we share certain cultural norms and kinship systems. So there is a huge emphasis on understanding these social relations in relation to the natural systems that people are embedded in. And on the top of all of these, freedom of choice and action, having freedom to access resources, to feel secure, to be feeling healthy, that's the most important and underpinning thing. Hence, that column is on the right-hand side because it's important for all of those four constituents on the left-hand side. So when we do kind of these assessments, so this is just the framework. When we try to apply this framework, we try to assess each of those links. As you can see, the brown ones or the thicker or the thinner arrows pointing out between the two. So the study that we did back here near Lake Etcham, working with the indigenous communities there. So we looked at, for both men and women, how these connections are for those people in terms of how they feel connected to the landscape, in terms of their well-being is either enhanced or, you know, otherwise. So having those connections to inform, if we really want to have people performing well, that we need to understand what are their connections and what is important for their well-being. So some of the things that men and women pointed out, I didn't include that study, that was done in 2011. I'll be happy to share later on in case you need. But there were quite different perspectives that men proposed and some that women proposed, that different sites that were important for their well-being. So quite an interesting piece of work. I should have highlighted in here. But my main focus was looking at the frameworks that we use for valuation. So IPBES, following Millennium Assessment, they proposed this framework in 2015, which is more or less the same as the Millennium Assessment framework, except that it used a bit more common person's layman's language. So rather than saying ecosystems, they use the term nature or Mother Earth or systems of life. And same way for ecosystem services, they started saying nature's benefits to people or nature's contribution to people. So NCP became a common concept. So we said it earlier in Millennium Assessment, it was human well-being, and then they focused on good quality of life, so which included living in harmony with nature and all those different constituents that were there in the Millennium Assessment. And they looked at what are the main drivers that's actually impacting on nature, which is right-hand side, the direct drivers, and then that influences nature's benefits or ecosystem services, and that ultimately affects our quality of life. So the idea is how you interpret all of these arrows, how you quantify them when you conduct case studies. The one main thing in these two frameworks that we point out in our work is that they highlight just one-way relationship because this is mostly coming from Western perspective, where people have got this kind of embedded notion that we are here to receive goods and services from nature without looking after nature, which is not the same among indigenous peoples and local communities, where people know that we will get those benefits only if we are looking after land. So we proposed another framework based on our work with the indigenous communities across Northern Australia. But before I get there, I wanted to say that indigenous values are so relational with their landscape. So, and we have more than 200 communities just across, because I wanted to talk about Northern Australia, just the top half. Across that around 3 million square kilometer landscape. So we got more than 250 communities who are living in remote locations and having deep connections with the landscapes that they're living in. And the beauty about these people is that they're living there permanently. Many of us, we come and go to an institute, like, wherever we feel that we want to work or wherever we want to live. But for them, they've been there. They are having these continuous connections with the landscape. So there is a sense of permanency. And in states and territories, especially Northern Territory, where people have about access to 50% of the land. But if we look across the north, more so in northern part of Western Australia, the Kimberley region and Northern Territory, but very less in Queensland, they got access to about 79% of the landscape to either manage or have an ownership, legal ownership of the landscape. So what we are trying to say here is that this healthy country, healthy people kind of notion is well embedded when people are living out on country, because they know we can get bush food only when country is healthy. But also their spiritual relationships and cultural relationships, clan relationships are stronger when country is healthy. So I have literally seen people crying when their country is not healthy, and they really get into tears. So based on our work over the last 15, 20 years in Northern Australia, we proposed this framework, building up on Millennium Assessment kind of framework. But what we wanted to highlight is that there is a two-way relationship between people's well-being and country, which in scientific terms, we can say ecosystems. So there is not just one way, but two-way relationship. And in terms of people's well-being benefits, they get their livelihood benefits. There are also real job opportunities, especially through carbon projects. They can have their traditional education, learning on country, bush food, their access to water. So there are also many customary economies that operate on indigenous land estate. One important part is that people's capabilities, that's also missing in those two big land frameworks, global frameworks. The capabilities are people's knowledge and skills, like we all got knowledge and skills, and we get that knowledge in this formal settings, and we get value for that knowledge and skill when we get the opportunity to practice it. But indigenous knowledge and skills are mainly in relation to how to manage their land, how to look after it, and how to be with your land. So those capabilities are slowly getting organized. One of them is indigenous fire management practice. Well, we are trying to actually emphasize that through economic frameworks, that this is one of the strongest things that we should be thinking and informing that. I was looking while doing this slide, looking into one of the older reports. It's not that old, it's about empowering communities, published in 2015, where the report clearly has got a picture showing that if people are away from homeland, because when they're on their homelands, they'll have lore and culture and all those things. But when you're away from homeland, you got the job, you can earn dollars. And it was so shocking for me to see that this is only 10 years ago. And we are saying that was the time when we had that movement where people were told to move away from homelands and come to cities. So it's not that old. And people manage through their cultural knowledge, cultural norms and ceremonies, they manage their ecosystems, and that delivers us many ecosystem services. So usually we focus on those biophysical ecosystem services, but there are many socio-cultural and well-being benefits. And then, of course, people's capabilities that get built up while working on country. And we try to apply this framework to assess the value for a few indigenous estates across the North. So one example of capability is that indigenous fire management that people have been practicing all across Northern Australia to keep country healthy. So we assess the value of ecosystem services which are delivered by this prescribed fire management all across Northern Australia. So in this case, this was done in 2021. In this case, we had about 79 projects all across Northern. Are you all familiar with savanna burning a little bit? Yeah. So savanna burning is under it's now called savanna fire management methodology, under which indigenous people managing their lands, they can earn carbon credits and sell them either in the market or to the Australian government. So here we had about 79 projects, out of which 27 are indigenous projects. And at that time, the indigenous projects were abating about 5 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. So they managed about 29 million hectares of land under these projects. So this savanna burning methodology is limited to that 600 mil rainfall ISO height at this stage. The idea is that's why we wanted to expand it to ecosystem services kind of economies to cover Northern Australia and also the landscapes below that 600 mil rainfall ISO height, because biodiversity is another big asset that we got across the Northern landscape and hasn't been considered for valuation. So when we looked at valuing services from this landscape that has been managed under savanna burning, we looked at 4 things. One is looking at the value of greenhouse gas emissions abatement, the well-being benefits that people get working on country, the opportunity cost of fire management that we have lost over the years, and also the ecosystem services values that we derive from managing those ecosystems. So when we looked at carbon benefits, which is a marketable value, so we get the market benefits. Many of those are marketable benefits. So the carbon benefits are worth about $10 million across the North out of those 79 projects. This is just directly selling those carbon credits and applying, I think, a minimum kind of that US dollars. At that time, it was 15 Australian dollars per carbon credit. But now the price has gone up to about $30 per ton of carbon abatement. So probably double the value now, like you're seeing $10 million, it should be about 20. But if I tell you the real figure, like the Arnhem Land mob, they abate quite a lot of carbon and earn more than $1 million a year just on carbon credits, and have been able to manage their cultural sites to continue with their traditional learning on country, and also to support well-being of their communities. So, and jobs created through this carbon economy, there are more than 600 people. So it's a very conservative figure. And then we looked at well-being benefits that people obtain working on country and living on country. So if you would have heard, Australian government produces these indigenous expenditure reports. And there is typically about $30 billion spent per year on indigenous welfare. So we call it, like, you know, in one way or the other, that it's just a welfare expenditure that needed to be included. And when you look at different parts of that welfare expenditure, there are 6-7 sectors. And key ones that we took to assess the value in this case is, one is like safe and supportive communities. So when we think about these communities who are living out in remote locations, they feel safe in their own environment if they're able to work on their country and to earn some money being there. So we looked at that. We looked at economic opportunities, how to create economic opportunities for people living on country, supporting them the work that they can do. We looked at healthy lives because a lot of them do say that if we live on country, if we are connected with country, we feel healthy compared to moving away, living in big cities. So we looked at just mainly 3 sectors, but if we could have looked in one way or the other, all the other 6, 7 sectors, the value would have been huge. So the total benefits in this case came to an estimate of about $200 million per year. So these are just for those 27 in fire management projects, the communities that they manage. So you can imagine if all the communities have a chance to manage that landscape, so this value will be huge. It's in terms of cost savings. So this is what we could convey to policy decision makers, that it's not something that people are doing for the sake of doing it. It actually helps to save costs for the government in terms of health and job creation and having safe communities, domestic violence, building up their capabilities, having a chance to learn on country. So how to integrate these ecosystem services with capabilities is a missing link in the global frameworks. What we try to say here is that if people's capabilities, which is like the set of abilities or functionings, in simple terms, it's the knowledge and skills that you and everyone has. So mostly we get that in formal settings. People living on country, many indigenous peoples, they get it by experience being on country. And when you happen to realize those capabilities, like I have now a chance to work in a university and to realize my ecological economics knowledge and skills, I can turn those into functionings. So that means I can achieve something out of it. Otherwise, my capability would have been, just sitting with me if I haven't had that achievement of realizing that capability. So that is what functioning is actually achievement. And the utility is the satisfaction. So from my own example, I feel very satisfied with the kind of work that I'm doing. I love it because I can work in that interface as an ecological economist. And that well-being, that satisfaction is the main thing. So if you are able to realize your functioning and achieve utility, that's what contributes to your human well-being. And that is the significant part of our economy. And that's where the economy should be sitting. Rather than going for GDP, we should be actually looking for how to enhance human well-being, because that's the ultimate goal for any economy. And underpinning all of these is freedom, which is essential for all these capabilities, functioning, and utility, that whatever kind of skills people want to build up, there should be freedom for them to do that. And this kind of concept fits very nicely in indigenous space when we try to evaluate those links between how people manage their country, look after their country, and what they value, how they value, and how it enhances their well-being. So an example of this is like, we all know about bush food and medicine, but it's not just about knowing, it's quite a lot about where that particular bush food is, when it's going to be right for picking, and how to process it. It's all those sort of, what are the medicinal values are attached to that bush food. So it's much more deeper than just knowing something. And this work, the capability work, I take on from Professor Amartya Sen, who is an economics Nobel laureate. And his main work has been in human welfare space, human well-being economy. We think about economy, we think economics is all about GDP, jobs, and opportunities and housing. But a significant component of economics is also about human well-being. And we have drifted away from that since Industrial Revolution. We have madly gone for GDP kind of well-being. So what Professor Sen says is, if you happen to have a chance, read this beautiful book saying development as freedom. So what he means by development is that it should be the development what people want, what they want to achieve in their lives. It's not about what you've been forced to live the way that the governments force you. So his idea is that if people got capabilities, if there is diversity of capabilities, then we can have those capabilities realized in the form of functionings. And once those functionings are achieved, then the responsibility for the governments is to actually develop the right kind of opportunities to realize those functionings and to enhance people's well-being. I'm sure many of us in this space, we may be feeling very, very satisfied in the space that we work in, but not many people have that opportunity to be feeling that contented, satisfied. So ultimate goal for human well-being is to actually align that work with your capabilities. And if you see that alignment, you can see that people's utility will be enhanced. And that utility is ultimate economics. So the key points from ecosystem services perspective is when we talk about valuation of ecosystem services, quite often people think it's about privatization, it's about commodification of ecosystem services. That's not true. I just wanted to say that very strongly and straightforwardly. Quite often people misinterpret it. Understanding the value of ecosystem services is about influencing, bringing them to the table of decision makers, saying this thing is important. Like we all value the scenic beauty that you are surrounded here with, and how to say not to cut the forest, how to protect it. So these kind of tools, they help. And monetary value of ecosystem services is not about the dollar investment that is required through nature-based economies. I'll talk about these ones in a minute. Quite often when even I go now to work with indigenous communities, sometimes they say, this is because we have assessed a number of properties for ecosystem services. People think, this is the value of ecosystem services. That means that we will be getting that much value. So we have to be very straightforward saying that is not true. Because we got the natural assets. That's something that's created by Mother Nature. We are simply the managers. So if we manage the landscape, and that's the effort that we put in to manage the landscape, that's where the investment is needed, not to see that this is the value of one species, whatever you want to highlight here. So quite often people say, what is the value of an elephant or a lorikeet or golden finch in our case? You can't value that because that golden finch is also connected to many other things. So you need to actually see all the links to get the value of that particular whole landscape, whole ecosystem, the chain of things that play a role for the existence of golden finch. So ecosystems are complex. It's a whole of systems approach. So they don't follow a typical supply and demand kind of relationship as an economic system. So typically when you will see economists working in this space, they'll be talking more about demand and supply. Those approaches don't fit. And that's what is happening in Australia now with the nature pair market, which is emerging fast. And we are trying to apply that typical economics approach, thinking this is another market we can capitalize on. And I'll come to that one in a minute. So the value could be, when we are assessing the ecosystem services values, could be both monetary and non-monetary. Doesn't have to be monetary all the time. Sometimes we can just rank them. We can just highlight in terms of decision-making that how these values are important in terms of people's well-being, like we did for the indigenous well-being, understanding what is the contribution of looking after country in terms of people's well-being. So as I said, economics is not all about markets. There is a significant component of human welfare within economics that is largely forgotten over the last 50 years or so. So moving on to these nature-based economies, which is a big part now within the federal government, DQ, and their focus is developing these nature-based economies. How it has all started, just a bit of background from the international kind of space. There has been a number of reports over the last just 4 or 5 years that has put a lot of emphasis that we need to invest in nature. The first report that came out was this Financing Nature by these TNC and other institutes that highlighted that what we invest in nature is nothing compared to what we get from nature. You may have heard about this Economics of Biodiversity report by Professor Sir Das Gupta from the UK, which became very famous globally because one key thing that he said for any businesses to succeed, they should be putting biodiversity on the top of their decision making. And then a few reports from UNEP that came assessing the state of finance for nature. And the recent one was 2024. And these reports, they highlight very clearly what we invest in nature and what we get from nature. So if we look at our global economy, which is about $101 trillion a year, it would have been more. This is back in 2022. So our cost of externalities, which is the impact of different businesses and different human activities on nature, worth about $9 trillion a year. And if we look at what we invest back into nature, which is fundamentally supporting our living on this planet, it's only $154 billion a year. So that's only less than 2% of the total cost of externalities, which is about $9 trillion. So we do even not like a tiny drop of water that goes into the ocean, the kind of impact that we humans create through our activities on planet Earth. So, and within that, within $144 billion, only $26 billion come from private investment, which are largely responsible for these impacts, for that cost of externalities. And this is kind of broadly the global situation, that most of this finance that comes to be invested in nature is public, compared to that it should be coming from private companies. And the recent report by the State of Finance for Nature says that we need to actually minimally invest about $296 billion per year if we want to repair our degraded systems. And there has been this demand coming from these global initiatives, Global Biodiversity Framework, CBD, IPCC, IPES, Sustainable Development Goals. This was the first time within Sustainable Development Goals that there was a clear link to climate action, life below water, life on land. So first time that we could see that ecosystems or nature is embedded within those Sustainable Development Goals. So hence that focus on investment in nature is, for the last 4 or 5 years, is gaining a lot of momentum. And within that, there is a strong focus to invest in indigenously managed lands globally. So there has been a huge emphasis on that we can get more success if we support indigenous peoples and local communities, because we can also tick those sustainable development goals, as well as we can also see a lot of achievements in terms of restoring those degraded ecosystems. So IPCC, they comprise about 2.5 billion people plus 476 million indigenous people. So if I'd usually combine the both to say about 3 billion people on planet Earth, and they manage about 28% of the landscape. So this is looking mainly the common lands and also the formally recognized indigenous estates. So not covering all. So we've been actually digging deeper into some of this because it doesn't cover many countries where indigenous peoples are not recognized as indigenous. What I mean to say is, like, I come from India, only 100 million people are recognized and indigenous out of 1.4 billion population. I don't know where else we come from, because 99% of the population in India is indigenous. We all belong to that land. And so and many nations haven't taken up that UN definition of indigenous because there are political and economic implications for those. And that's the same situation across the Asia Pacific. So when you talk about indigenous, I feel like this figure 3 million that I'm saying is still a big, huge underestimate. And then looking at that, whether we say 32% of the global landmass, that was the WWF report, that's been managed by the indigenous peoples, I think that figure will be still a very much underestimate because it doesn't take those lands managed by local communities in their own way. It's only the common lands which are registered under the central government systems that are accounted in this case. And 26% of the protected areas, their lands are managed by the indigenous people. And most importantly, when we talk about these lands managed by indigenous people, about 80% of these lands are in better condition compared to their counterparts. So 80% of lands are in good health, ecologically, in ecological sense, they say in good health. So Australia is taking a lead in nature-based solutions, building up and supporting indigenous communities. And Australia hosted the first Global Nature Positive Summit in Sydney last year in October, where I had the opportunity to go and see the momentum. So we had lots of people from overseas, mainly from the Asia Pacific. And we passed this Nature Pair Market Act, building up on the success of AQUA scheme, which is the Australian Carbon Credit Unit scheme. They proposed this Nature Pair Market, and Nature Pair Market bill was passed in December 2023 and became an act last year. So under this act now, there are a number of methodologies that are under development. And I'll share some of the concerns that's happening with that development, but different types of methodologies that's been coming up. One that's already there is about reforestation of native vegetation. So what it means is, like with the AQUA scheme, you can actually earn some credits, some biodiversity certificates, and then you can sell them in the private market. So but I've been fortunate as an ecological economist working in this space and funded through these different organizations, including NARC project, where we worked on developing these ecosystem services market opportunities. Under that project, our first thing was to actually look at that, where do we stand nationally in terms of our ecosystem services markets? So which I call here TESS, but you can say ecosystem services market economies. So PES stands for Payment for Ecosystem Services Schemes. So Australia already runs a number of those schemes, conservation agreements, reef credit schemes, which is very common up here. Water buyback back in Murray-Darling Basin has been one of the famous ones, running for the last more than 20 years, and ECO scheme. And there has been a lot of funding that has gone into each of these schemes. And I just wanted to highlight that 97% of our finance that government puts into these schemes is actually public money. So you and I are contributing, while I'm saying that the private companies that take the advantage of natural resources, they only contribute about 33% in this case. So that's the irony of these things. So what we are arguing through our work is that we need to incentivize indigenous peoples to manage their estates across Northern Australia, because it makes a good economic sense. In another paper, we highlighted this, that it can save somewhere between $4 to $18 billion a year for the Australian government if we actually support those people living in remote communities to manage their land holistically, not just for carbon. There is a lot of that feedback coming from carbon managers who are participating in those carbon projects, that we need to go for much more holistic management of country rather than just for carbon. So our idea since then has been that we should be looking at broader ecosystem services economies. And in the recent this Nature Pair Act, there is a very good clause that says that we need to have consent from eligible interest native title holders to register for any nature repair project. So while doing this work, we've been developing a nature-based economies framework. So we have had some groups up here, Jabugai, we had meetings with them, what kind of framework they want and how this nature repair market will, what it means to them. And having those conversations, like what kind of indicators, what kind of methods they want. So we came up with this framework, which is probably the first in its own sense that comes from ground up, because typically these frameworks come from top down. So you may have heard about Accounting for Nature and many other companies, Green Collar and others here. They develop their own frameworks using the knowledge and skills of many people that are either involved in that institution or they engage with ecologists and economists to come up with the frameworks. So this is the first time we've been working with communities, actually what they want, that they can say to the investors that this is what we can deliver, rather than coming from top down. Because my argument in this case was quite often these frameworks come from top down or any business proposal, and then we say indigenous people have failed to deliver, hence this scheme is not successful. But in this case, we are proposing this very much ground up informed framework where we ask people that what it is on their country that they want to value, they want to manage. So we had this work across Northern Australia, a few communities in the Northern Territory, in Arnhem Land, some here and some in the Kimberley. Based on that work, so huge amount of work over the last 3-4 years, but we developed this framework and we had 2 domains in this that came very prominently, having those focus group meetings with the TOs. One was that they pointed out we need to have healthy people and culture. If culture is strong, that means the knowledge is passed on, people's capabilities are strong, they can look after country. And the second domain was healthy country and people. So if country is healthy, people are healthy. So just some examples of healthy people and culture. One of the things that TOs have told us that having ceremonies on country is actually a good indicator of saying whether we are connected with country or not. Okay? So then we ask them, okay, how should we measure it? It should be number of people, and especially the young participants. If they're on country, they're performing those ceremonies, that means tomorrow they're able to do something, practice their knowledge and skills. And this other important thing is like storytelling. It said if elders are able to tell their story to young ones, they're able to pass on their skills and knowledge. Otherwise, we are leaving that behind. So we are not able to look after. So some kind of indicators. Our next step is to actually build up these tools that we can hand over to TOs so they can report in their own way about the state of their country and also the delivery of ecosystem services that they may agree for the investors to deliver. So healthy country and healthy people, a good example is fire management, where people suggested us that if we got a good fire management managed by right people, right way, that can tell us our country is healthy. And that means we are healthy. So looking at some trends or having NEFI mapping, that can help us to build up those tools. So some of those indicators, we got about, I think, 20 key indicators in the paper. So if you wanted to have a look. But developing these nature-based economies or nature repair market, as we say in Australia, is not so easy. So at this stage, the Australian government is mainly through the Nature Repair Committee, asking for some methods, but not any plan for what kind of right policy instruments we need at each state and territory level. So at this stage, it's been more like a market instrument. So like they have done for Aqua Scheme, it's built up more or less the same way. But we argue that if we want to actually manage the country properly, we should be looking at a holistic picture, biodiversity, cultural values, socio-cultural values, people's capabilities, their ability to manage country and and water bodies, and they should be all holistic, because at an ecosystem scale, everything is linked. At the market level, they see each and everything as in isolation from each other. So biodiversity is linked with carbon credits anyway. So if you're managing country for carbon, you're also managing country for biodiversity. So both are linked. How can you separate it out in applying the typical market mechanism? So I'm very doubtful about that. And we propose this more holistic framework, especially working with Professor Robert Costanza. He's the one who proposes this common assets trust. And we thought this can be really a good policy setting for the Australian states and territories if we really want to implement nature pair market in a right way. So where we will have indigenous land managers or any non-indigenous land managers, they can deliver ecosystem services depending on the framework that they want to choose. And then there will be beneficiaries, both public and private, and whatever funds that will go, that can actually go to some kind of state level or territory level trust, and then that can help to manage the country or indigenous estate in this case. And one of the key things in this case is when we are talking about central platform rather than having individual, because at this stage, what is happening is in carbon projects, there are a lot of intermediary companies that are playing a big role between land managers and the market. And nobody knows, there is no transparency, who earns how much. And there is no central platform for the land managers to learn, what their credits are worth for, because market is evolving very quickly. So our purpose, and they end up spending too much for legal paperwork. And in this case, we are proposing in this particular paper that if we have a central framework where there is a lot more trust and reliability for the land managers to go, especially indigenous land managers who have no experience in private market. So they can actually get authentic information, and then they can decide which way they want to sell their biodiversity credits or country credits, whatever they want to say it. So that's what is proposed. So there are huge challenges in terms of developing these nature-based economies. We don't currently have a coordinated approach at the federal level. We need to go for a more coherent and coordinated approach. We need to minimize transactional costs, because at this stage, transactional costs are too high. We all are going for biodiversity certificates and want to sell them in the market. We all own some piece of land. We are all going to invest so much money in legal work just to get there. So if we got a central platform, it makes much more sense to get that advice. We want simple but reliable mechanisms. Quite often, those mechanisms that has been developed by these big companies, they are very complicated. Even as an ecologist, it's very hard to get through them. And how can land managers kind of, manage that? That means they have to have someone else to be employed to work on through those framework and all that paperwork. So what we are trying to say is to develop some kind of tools and mechanisms that are much more easier, simpler for the land managers to apply themselves rather than relying on external parties. So we need to develop some efficient and equitable, effective conservation and well-being outcomes, both for people and nature, not just like we are focusing on carbon or we are focusing on biodiversity. We need to get out of this silo approach and move on to more holistic management of country. Thank you.
Good. All right, thank you very much. Questions here or online?
Sure.
Question? Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your talk. It's very interesting. I was wondering you may not know this, but in the area of carbon credits, when you fly over Kakadu and a lot of it's burnt black, how do they go about measuring the carbon credits in that instance, when they've done the burning? Does that affect the counts of the carbon credits at all?
So if you're looking at Kakadu, next to Kakadu is Vatican. That's where the first carbon project started back in 2005, 2006. It was funded by ConocoPhillips, which is a mining giant. But that's how the whole story started. So the way, if you look at like Kakadu doesn't look that nice compared to the area surrounding it, which is mostly Arnhem land. So that's been beautifully managed. Kakadu hasn't been beautifully managed, but it has been improving over the years. So when you measure that, it's the beauty about fire management is a lot of that management and auditing happens through remote sensing. So NEFI is one of the best website. If you have heard about this Northern Australian Fire Information site that is sitting within our Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research, but that's where I had the opportunity to learn a lot more about carbon. So it can actually sense that what is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that has gone from that type of fire, whether it was a wildfire or it's a cool fire. So quite often, if it's a cool fire, we know because this work has been done over the last 30 years, we got the hard data to build up the model that sits behind this assessment. So it's called SABBAT, that model, and they're turning it to full CAM at the federal level, but the original model is SABBAT. So if you put the area of the site that you are interested in, you can actually assess while managing fire at that particular year, that how many greenhouse gas emissions you're saving. So it's quite sophisticated. Yeah.
Other questions? Did you put your hand? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. You mentioned it at the end where there's quite a few players in the space, especially in the carbon and increasingly the biodiversity crediting markets. What do you think the appetite for the approach that you're talking about here is at the federal level and then the local level to try and implement that?
Yes, we've been pushing from our side. JQ have held under this nature repair committee that they have set up, have held some public consultations. So I've been actively participating in that, and there have been some key indigenous people experts who've been actually playing a key role there as well. So I have highlighted and sent these papers to those people to kind of consider more holistic picture rather than just one at a time. So there is a bit of sense because earlier they didn't have like northern landscape. When we look at it, it's the least modified in Australia. So especially savanna landscape. So yours may be more modified here. But if we look at Kimberley and Northern Territory, so our landscapes are much better compared to, I'm not saying that they're perfect, but they're much better. So our argument was that these landscapes have been managed. That means, does it mean because a lot of these schemes, when they come in, they're actually following the principle of paying the polluter. You know, you're fixing the problem. So that means not paying the polluter. That means that if you have created a problem, you'll get money to fix it. So that's what is happening with reef credits. That's what is happening with carbon as well. So if you have burned badly over the last, if your country has burned badly over the last 20 years, you can get more carbon credits because your baseline is higher. The same way with your reef credits here. If you have caused a lot of that nitrogen and soil loss from your lands, then you will get more reef credits compared to someone who have managed it well. So we argued that with DQ team working in nature repair, that this will not fit to indigenous context where they have managed their land well over the last centuries, millennia, and that means they will lose again. So, and they have kind of now got some provision there that stewardship is included in this nature repair, that they have included like management of country is part of the activity. So, which is a good news. It's not totally about fixing the problem, which has been the tendency since last 20, 30 years in all those payment for ecosystem services schemes. And that's a typical economics approach. And that's what I argue, that when we try to apply these typical economic approaches to fix environmental problems, we are not looking at the systems, because ecosystems work as a holistic system. It's not that you can separate one thing from the other. Everything is linked. So we try to convey that. And I try to convey that in a way that we can highlight the numbers behind it. Sure.
I also thank you very much for the talk. It was quite eye-opening, and I'm quite interested in this global perspective, because obviously this whole framework can be scaled up, towards the entire world. And you've mentioned on one of the slides about the global economy, what it's worth, and then there was also mentioned externalities. Yeah. And there was a money value on externalities, like the 9 trillion or whatever that was. And then in the top corner, there was about 300 billion for repair of degraded ecosystems, which was not part of the 9 trillion. And so now what I'm wondering is, could you maybe dive a little bit into what are these externalities and what is the money value? Where did that come from? Because I'm really curious if that's the same concept that I've got of externalities, or if that's a different thing.
Yeah, externalities are especially in this case, negative externalities, which are the negative impacts of human activities on nature, on natural assets. So these externalities, that cost has been assessed in one of those reports, Unit 1 in 2022. So that $9 trillion comes, there are big companies that's been assessing this. If you search for true costing, so this is a company based in the UK that assesses the cost of these externalities for big companies like Puma, Nike, and all the others. So what they did is they got this data together for these different kind of externalities that human activities have caused globally. So that figure is 9 trillion. And that when they're looking at how much, minimally, conservatively, that we need to invest and fix the problems that we are facing. And that figure is $296 billion a year. That also came from the State of Finance for Nature. Yeah, so the externalities costs are assessed differently from different sources. And that's the global figure that they came up with.
So and those 300 billion, I'm not quite sure if I can follow. Why are they not included in the cost in those 9 trillion?
No, that's not included. That's the figure that's been put up by UNEP and others to say that how much we need to invest in nature. The cost is there. So that is the minimum amount per year we need to invest in nature to restore degraded ecosystems. Yeah, I should make it more clear in that slide.
Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, Bill, it's Penny here. How are you going?
Good.
Thanks, Kamal. That's a great talk. We trade carbon credits up here in the Atherton Tablelands, and we're getting a very, very good price per credit because of its biodiversity co-benefits, even though we haven't actually properly measured them. It's probably due to our location. But also we're working on the nature repair idea market. And I know that working in this space, there's no mention of this more holistic view that you're putting forward. So I'm interested in how you're going to try and push it forward. One thing, though, that I just like to make, so what's happening is it's becoming even more past, it's even more divided up, except that now there's a couple of methods being compiled together. But I was at the ALCA conference last week, and the ALCA itself, the Australian Alliance for Carbon, the private carbon managers, private conservation managers, they themselves are helping to develop a method under the Nature Repair Act that looks at protection of land. So the idea is to pay people to protect intact areas. And I thought maybe that's an avenue to actually embed a few more of your ideas.
Yeah, no, thanks, Penny. And that's exactly what we've been trying to convey. Like you say, biodiversity as co-benefit, but I take biodiversity as one of the main benefit as well. So it's just us, we kind of, reduce the value of that asset by saying it's a co-benefit. If we say it's a carbon benefit, it's biodiversity benefit, it's well-being benefits, it's social cultural benefit, everything is important. We can't isolate one from the other. So when we are talking about this ALCA approach, and there has been some work done in New South Wales, they got a biodiversity trust, what they call biodiversity conservation trust. So unfortunately, that hasn't been taken up that much, but it works within New South Wales and run by the government. And they value this holistic approach, like, mainly, although they look at biodiversity, but also holistically. So they fund as such the benefits. What we try to highlight, the last paper that I showed on nature-based solutions, is that we highlight three main schemes in that paper. One is TESS from Costa Rica that looked at holistic picture. So they looked at 4 ecosystem services together. So if you're managing your land, so there are 2 ways of doing these investments in nature-based solutions and nature-based economies. One is that you can go for input-based mechanism, which will be what are your inputs to manage that country? And then you get benefit for that, like that will be your dollar amount. I mean, your inputs plus some 10% extra, 20% extra for paperwork or whatever, and then you get that. The other one is this output-based approach that we've been following, which is for carbon, and same, we are going for biodiversity. So we think if you produce that many carbon credits, you'll get that much money. Doesn't matter how you produce, what your inputs are, but it's the output that we look at. So I think for Australia at this stage, we are still going that output-based approach. What we are trying to say is that we can look at other global case studies where they have been very, very successful. Costa Rica has been running these schemes for the last 45 years, since 1980s. And they go for more holistic, 4 ecosystem services that they count together. So which is carbon, biodiversity, aesthetic beauty, and water. Why can't we follow something similar? So Mexico has done something similar as well, but they focus sometimes more on water, but also some indigenous perspectives. And then we got a very good case study from New South Wales on this biodiversity conservation trust. It's really beautifully designed, the way that trust is set up by the government. And that should be something we should all look at, that is much more holistic than just looking for carbon or biodiversity. So that's where we want to send these messages out, Penny. And yeah, happy to liaise later on to have deeper conversation on this topic.
Very good. Okay, well, we've gone a little over time. So thank you very much, Kamal. Very interesting talk, very relevant. And I think a lot of people really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.